Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in March. I ended up reading 8 books, which for me might be some kind of record. I normally read maybe 3 or 4 books a month. Saying that, some of these were short books, one was a graphic novel and one was an audiobook, so I think all of that helped. I read a bit of horror, a little bit of sci-fi, some true crime, a bit of thriller. So overall I had a pretty good month, and first up I read Such Small Hands by Barba. This is translated from the Spanish by Lisa Dillman, and it's a novella, and this is probably classed as literary fiction. This is about a young girl whose parents die in an accident and she is sent to live in an orphanage. The other girls in the orphanage have very mixed feelings about her. They are intrigued by her and she's unique, she's new, yet they're also kind of jealous of her because of the same reasons, and she has a hard time fitting in with them. I really enjoyed this. It is very well written, the language and the writing are all fantastic, and it has a kind of dreamlike quality to it. There are some definitely dark and disturbing tones to the story, and it has this combination of the beautiful and the grotesque, which I really liked. This one had been on my to-read list for quite a while, so I'm glad I finally got around to reading it. I really enjoyed it, highly recommend it. I gave it 4 stars out of 5. Next up I read Something Wicked This Way Comes by Bradbury. This was my first Bradbury and definitely won't be my last. This is a horror / dark fantasy about 2 13-year-old boys, they're best friends, and a dark carnival comes to their town and strange things start happening to some of the other people of the town, and they're realising that something weird is going on with this carnival and the people that run it, and they seem to be the only ones that have noticed that these things are happening, and so they have to be the ones that try and stop it. And it's about friendship. It's also about the relationship between one of the boys and his father, and overall I really liked this. It is really well written. I did love Ray Bradbury's style. It does get quite flowery at times, and I like that for the most part, but I know it's not for everyone. This was actually last month's pick for my horror book club, and a couple of other people that read it didn't quite get on with the flowery language as much, but they still really enjoyed the story. It has a mixture of sometimes feeling like it's written for a younger audience, and other times that it's definitely for an adult audience, so it's kind of a strange mix. There are definitely some parts of it that are quite adult and some kind of creepy and disturbing scenes going on. So I really liked this and I gave it 4 stars out of 5. Next up I read Black Hole by Charles Burns. This is a graphic novel and it's set in Seattle in the 1970s, and we're so it's about that time in your life when you're a teenager and you're kind of part trying to fit in and part trying to rebel, and it's about friendships, relationships, family, alienation, and it's kind of a sad story I found, and pretty bleak, and I found it quite melancholy, and I did really like it. I ended up giving it 4 stars out of 5. And yeah, the guy's obviously a talented storyteller and artist, and I definitely want to check out more of his work. Next up I read a short story collection called The Outcasts Spirits and Other Stories by Lady Dilke, and these were originally published in the late 1800s. This one was in the horror section, although not all of the stories I would kind of class in that genre, but they're all quite gothic. So if you do like classic literature, especially gothic literature, then I would definitely recommend it to you. A lot of the stories have a kind of fairy tale or fable kind of style to them. And overall I did enjoy the collection, although some stories I enjoyed more than others. I definitely preferred the darker ones. There are a few that deal with death and I liked those more than the ones that were maybe a bit more religious. The downfall for me is some of the language. I'm not a great reader of classics and I do struggle with the language sometimes, so some of these stories I just didn't feel I was really understanding exactly what was going on, so that's more of a fault of my own, I guess. I gave this 3 stars out of 5, but some of the stories in particular I gave 4 stars to, and I definitely appreciate the work as a whole and I'm glad it exists and has been, you know, republished in this collection, and I still really recommend it. Just, I guess, know what you're getting into with this kind of era of literature. Next up I read The Beauty by Aliya Whiteley, and this particular edition contains 2 novellas, The Beauty and Peace Pipe, and they're both about 100 pages long and I really enjoyed this. The Beauty is a horror slash sci-fi dystopian story. It is set in a world where all the women have died and we're following a particular community of men and boys and how their community is now living and dealing with things. Everyone within this group has their own kind of jobs within their community, and we're mainly following Nate, who is the storyteller of the group. So every night he will tell stories about the women to try and keep their memories going. All of the women from their group have been buried, and one day they start noticing this weird fungus growing in the ground where they've been buried, and strange things happen from there on. This was really well written and it's about community and social political hierarchy, gender and gender roles, and I really loved it. It's one that definitely kept me thinking after I finished it and I think would make for a great discussion. The second story in this book, Peace Pipe, is a sci-fi story and it's about someone who has returned from a mission to communicate with a particular planet and the species that live there. Next up I read The Hole by Hye-Young Pyun, and translated from the Korean by Sora Kim Russell. This is billed as a psychological thriller, but I don't necessarily agree with that. This was a really disappointing read for me. I was really looking forward to it. This is about a husband and wife who are in a car accident. The wife dies and the husband is in a coma for some time, and he starts to come out of the coma. He's in hospital and we're following him recovering from that, and also his mother-in-law, who has just lost her daughter, trying to come to terms with that, and also it's just the two of them now, and she is going to be with him to help him recover. So the first chapter of this was, you know, bringing us up to speed with the situation and what had happened and what's going on now. He is coming out of the coma and he is mostly paralysed and he can't talk, so he's basically a prisoner in his own body, and I mean that in itself is terrifying and heartbreaking, but other than that there's not really much else going on. The next half of the book is all backstory. We're learning about this husband and wife and their relationship, and also their relationship with their parents, and not much happens, honestly, and I didn't find it particularly interesting. Then the second half does pick up a little bit. We're back in the present day and we're focusing on his recovery and his mother-in-law. Is she actually helping him, or is there something sinister going on? But again, it wasn't very interesting, and I was really just reading it to hopefully reach the interesting part. It did get slightly interesting in like the final 10% of the book, but I shouldn't have to wait that long for it to pick up, and it was kind of a little bit too little too late at that point, so I found this one really disappointing. I couldn't recommend it, unfortunately. By the time I finished it, I was just really underwhelmed. It fell really flat for me, and I ended up giving it 2 stars out of 5. Next up, I listened to an audiobook. This was True Crime Addict by James Renner. This is about the disappearance of a student called Maura Murray, who disappeared back in 2004. And the author, James Renner, is investigating this. He's a journalist and he is interested in true crime and has done stuff previously in that area, and he became intrigued by this story and decided to investigate it for himself and then wrote this book. This was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I basically picked this one because I'm trying to get into audiobooks, but I have a hard time really connecting with them. I find it easy to kind of not focus enough on them, and I thought that listening to non-fiction might be better for me, so I ended up just finding something that was available on audiobook through the library, and this was kind of what I stumbled upon, and it had good reviews. So this is narrated by the author, and I quite liked that. I found his delivery engaging and interesting. The story was quite intriguing, but overall his presentation of the story was a bit all over the place. He talks a lot about himself and his family, his background, and some of it I could see could be somewhat related to the case or his reasons for investigating the case, but at times it just felt a bit self-indulgent, and honestly, he doesn't come across as the greatest person, definitely not the greatest husband, and I know we all have our faults. Like, I know I'm definitely not perfect, but I don't really want or need to know that you still go to strip clubs even though you're married, and that you don't like skinny girls, you prefer brunettes to blondes. Like, this has no impact on the story other than my viewpoint on you as an individual. There were quite a few things he says that just made me not like the guy, and the story itself was intriguing enough for me to keep reading, but had it not been, I may have not finished this. Once I'd finished it, I did glance at some other reviews, and I did see that other people had the same thoughts, so at least I'm not alone in that. I think he does come across as not the most likeable person. And the case itself was interesting, and I think he did a lot of investigating into it, maybe a bit too much, kind of became obsessed with it and maybe went too far, looked too much into it. I think if you like true crime, then I would still recommend this. If not, probably give it a miss. I liked it okay, but I didn't love it, and I think the times that it just went off on different tangents rather than focusing on the story were a bit too much, and I ended up giving it 3 stars out of 5. And lastly, I read The House of Small Shadows by Adam Nevill. This is a horror novel. This is about our protagonist Catherine. She works in the antiques business. Her boss is contacted by the niece of a very famous taxidermist who died some time ago, she is now wanting to get someone in to look at all of his works and potentially have them auctioned off. So Catherine is sent over to her home called the Red House, and she thinks she's just going there to view and take notes about all of these taxidermy pieces and his antique doll collection, all of which are going to be very valuable. But things are not quite as they seem. This is creepy and intriguing and disturbing. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to film a full review of this, so hopefully I will post that later this month. But yeah, I really liked this one. I gave it 4 stars out of 5. So that was everything I read in March. Let me know if you've read any of these, let me know what you thought, or tell me what your favourite book that you read in March was. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!